Sarah Martinez never imagined that defending her family's century-old water rights would turn her into the most hated woman in Millbrook County. When mysterious chemicals began poisoning her private well, the same well that had sustained for generations of her family, she discovered the shocking truth. Her own neighbors, desperate for water during the worst drought in decades, had been systematically sabotaging her supply. But they made one fatal mistake. They forgot that Sarah's great-grandfather had been far more cunning than they ever imagined when he built their water system. Now, with one turn of a valve buried deep in her basement, Sarah held the power to cut off water to half the county. The question wasn't whether she'd use it was how far she'd go for revenge. The water tasted wrong. Sarah Martinez stood at her kitchen sink, spitting the metallic liquid into the porcelain basin with a grimace that deepened the worry lines around her dark eyes. At 38, she'd been drinking from this well her entire life through childhood, summers when the water ran so cold it made her teeth ache, through her college years when she'd bring jugs back to campus because nothing else tasted like home, and through the 5 years since she'd moved back to care for her aging father. She knew this water better than her own heartbeat, and this wasn't it. "Dad," she called toward the living room where Miguel Martinez sat in his worn leather recliner, oxygen tank hissing softly beside him. "When's the last time you had the well tested?" 2 months ago, came his raspy reply. "Clean as a whistle, Mia." "Why?" Sarah filled a mason jar with the suspicious water, holding it up to the afternoon light streaming through her grandmother's lace curtains. The liquid appeared clear, but there was something off about the way it caught the light, too many tiny particles dancing in suspension, like microscopic snow. "I'm taking this to Jenkins' lab," she announced, grabbing her keys from the hook by the back door. "Sarah." Her father's voice carried the weight of 4 decades spent as Millbrook County's water commissioner, a job that had taught him to read trouble in people's voices, like storm clouds on the horizon. "What aren't you telling me?" She paused. One hand on the door handle. How could she explain the sick feeling that had been growing in her stomach for weeks? The way her morning coffee had started tasting bitter, not from the grounds, but from something deeper. The way her tomato plants, the same heirloom varieties her great-grandmother had brought from Mexico, were yellowing despite the drought-breaking rains they'd finally received last month. "Maybe nothing," she said, but they both knew she was lying. The drive to Jenkins' environmental lab took her through the heart of Millbrook, a town that had seen better decades. Main Street looked like a mouth with half its teeth knocked out, empty storefronts with newspaper-covered windows, a diner that had been temporarily closed for 6 months, and the old movie theater where she'd had her first kiss, now advertising space for rent. But it was the houses that told the real story. Lawn after lawn of brown, brittle grass, garden sprinklers sitting unused beside water conservation zone signs that the county had been forced to post when the aquifer levels dropped to historic lows. Even the old oak trees looked thirsty, their leaves curling inward like clenched fists. Millbrook was dying of thirst, and everyone knew it. Everyone except the Martinez family, whose 100-year-old well still ran strong and clear, or had, until now. Sarah Martinez. Dr. Patricia Jenkins looked up from her microscope with surprise when Sarah walked into the lab. "Haven't seen you since high school. How's your father? Hanging in there?" Sarah set the mason jar on the sterile counter. "I need this tested. Full panel bacteria, chemicals, heavy metals, everything." Patricia's eyebrows rose. "Everything. That's expensive. And from what I remember, your family's well has always been. I don't care what it costs." The sharpness in Sarah's voice surprised them both. "Something's wrong." Patricia studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Rushed up, please. I'll have preliminary results by tomorrow morning. Full report by Friday." Sarah was halfway home when she saw the truck. It was parked on the shoulder of County Road 47, about a quarter-mile from her property line, close enough to see her house through the cottonwoods, far enough away to avoid suspicion. The truck itself wasn't unusual. Half the county drove similar, Ford F-150s with rusted wheel wells and sun-faded paint. But the man behind the wheel was using binoculars, and those binoculars were pointed directly at her well house. Sarah pulled over, her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd grown up in Millbrook, knew every family for 3 generations back, but she couldn't place this man. Middle-aged, wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his face, with the kind of weathered hands that spoke of outdoor work. As she watched, he lowered the binoculars and made a note in a small spiral notebook. Then he started the truck and drove away, leaving nothing but tire tracks in the dirt and a cold certainty in Sarah's chest that someone was watching her home. That night, she couldn't sleep. Every sound seemed amplified: the settling of the old adobe walls, the whisper of wind through the Russian olives her great-grandfather had planted as a windbreak, the distant howl of coyotes in the arroyos. But it was the silence that unnerved her most. The silence where there should have been the familiar hum of the well pump cycling on and off. At 2 a.m., she gave up on sleep and pulled on her boots. The well house sat 50 yards from the main house, a small concrete structure that her great-grandfather, Eliso Martinez, had built in 1924, when he'd first claimed this land under the Desert Land Act. The heavy wooden door was secured with the same brass padlock that had protected the well for decades. But as Sarah approached with her flashlight, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Fresh scratches around the lock. Bright silver gouges in the brass where someone had tried to pick it. Her hands shook as she unlocked the door and stepped inside. The well pump hummed quietly in the corner, everything appearing normal at first glance. But Sarah had spent countless childhood hours in this space, helping her father with maintenance, learning the intricate dance of pipes and pressure gauges that brought life-giving water up from the aquifer 200 feet below. She noticed the difference immediately. The main pipe, the one that carried water from the pump to the house, had been disconnected and reconnected. The job was professional, nearly invisible, but the pipe wasn't quite aligned the way her father always left it. And there, on the concrete floor, was a single drop of something that wasn't water. Something dark and viscous that made her stomach turn. Sarah aimed her flashlight at the connection point and saw it, a small T-joint that hadn't been there before, so skillfully installed that anyone not intimately familiar with the system would never notice it. The joint led to a thin tube that disappeared through a hole drilled in the concrete wall, a hole that led directly to the access point where the county's new water main ran past their property. Someone had tapped into their well, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the small plastic container attached to the T-joint, designed to slowly release its contents into their water supply. The container was nearly empty now, but she could still see the residue coating the inside walls. Something thick and oily that reflected her flashlight beam like an oil slick. They weren't just stealing her water, they were poisoning it. Sarah's phone rang at 7:15 the next morning, jarring her from the first real sleep she'd managed after discovering the sabotage. "Sarah, it's Patricia Jenkins. I'm afraid I have some disturbing news about your water sample." Sarah sat up, already reaching for the notebook where she'd spent the pre-dawn hours, documenting everything she'd found in the well house. "How bad?" "Bad enough that I'm required by law to report this to the county health department immediately. You've got industrial-grade hydraulic fluid in your water supply, enough to cause serious health problems with prolonged exposure. There are also traces of benzene and several other chemicals that have no business being anywhere near drinking water." The notebook fell from Sarah's suddenly numb fingers. Hydraulic fluid, the kind used in heavy construction equipment. "Sarah, you and your father need to stop drinking this water immediately. I'm talking bottled water only until we can figure out how this happened. I already know how it happened." Sarah's voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. "Someone put it there." Silence on the other end of the line. "Then, are you saying someone deliberately contaminated your well?" "I'm saying someone installed equipment to do exactly that, and I have photographs to prove it." "Jesus." Patricia's voice dropped to a whisper. "Sarah, if that's true, this isn't just an environmental issue. This is attempted poisoning. You need to call the sheriff." But as Sarah hung up the phone, she realized that calling Sheriff Bob Hendricks would be more complicated than Patricia imagined. Because Bob Hendricks lived on Cedar Street, in the new subdivision where half the county commissioners had built their homes, the same subdivision that had been without reliable water for 6 months, the same subdivision that would benefit most from access to the Martinez family's abundant well. Sarah walked to her living room window and looked out at the brown, thirsty landscape of Millbrook County. Somewhere out there, people were desperate enough to poison an old man and his dog. Sarah's hands trembled as she traced the faded lines on her great-grandfather's map. What she'd initially thought was a simple property survey was actually a masterpiece of engineering for a spiderweb of underground connections that linked the Martinez well to every major water line in the northern half of Millbrook County. "Mia," her father's voice carried from the living room, weaker than usual. "Everything okay?" "Dad, I need you to see something." Sarah helped Miguel to the kitchen table, spreading the leather portfolio before him. "Tell me about great-grandfather's water system." Miguel's rheumy eyes sharpened as they focused on the map. Despite his failing lungs, his mind remained as sharp as the day he'd retired from the County Water Commission. "Where did you find this?" "Hidden in your desk?" "Dad, someone's been poisoning our well." The oxygen tank hissed in the sudden silence. Miguel's weathered hands clenched into fists. "Show me." For the next hour, Sarah laid out everything: the mysterious truck, the sabotaged well house, the lab results that proved deliberate contamination. But it was the photographs of the T-joint and injection system that made her father's face go gray with rage. "Hydraulic fluid," he whispered. "That's what they use in the big excavators. The ones they've been using to dig new water lines out on Cedar Street, the same Cedar Street where Sheriff Hendricks lives." Miguel nodded grimly. "Along with half the city council and 3 county commissioners. They've been without reliable water since April, when their main line finally gave out. Been trucking water in from the next county over." Sarah studied the map again, following the network of lines that connected their property to the wider system. "Dad, what exactly is this?" Miguel was quiet for so long she thought he hadn't heard her. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades of carefully guarded secrets. "Your great-grandfather was nobody's fool, Mia. When he built our well in 1924, he knew that water would eventually become more valuable than gold in this part of New Mexico, so he didn't just drill deep, he drilled smart." His finger traced the main line on the map. "See this? This isn't just our well. This is the master connection to the original county aquifer system." When they updated everything in the 70s, they built around our infrastructure instead of replacing it. Cheaper that way. What does that mean? It means your great-grandfather built us a kill switch, Sarah. Every drop of water that flows to the Cedar Street subdivision, the new industrial park, and half the residential developments built since 1980 flows through valves that we control. The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. We could shut them off completely. Legally, it's all covered under our original water rights agreement with the county. Sarah stared at the map, her mind racing. Outside, the late afternoon sun beat down on the drought-stricken landscape, making the air shimmer with heat. Somewhere out there, the people who'd poisoned her family's water were probably sitting in air-conditioned offices, planning their next move, confident that they held all the cards. They had no idea they'd just handed her a royal flush. Her phone buzzed. Patricia Jenkins, calling back with additional test results. Sarah, I've got more bad news. The contamination levels are actually increasing. Whatever's been introduced to your system is still actively leaching into the water supply. Meaning someone is still adding poison to your well. This isn't a one-time thing, it's ongoing. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. How long would it take to cause permanent damage? Patricia's pause said everything. At current contamination levels, if you'd been drinking this water for another month or two, Sarah, we could be talking about liver damage, neurological problems, even thank you. Sarah ended the call, her hands shaking with fury that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the realization that someone had been trying to slowly murder her and her father. Miguel must have seen something in her expression, because he reached across the table and gripped her wrist. What are you thinking, Mia? I'm thinking it's time to pay a visit to Cedar Street. Sarah, no, Dad, these people poisoned us. They're still poisoning us, and they think they can get away with it because we're just one family against half the county power structure. She stood, folding the map and tucking it into her back pocket, but they forgot something important. What's that? We hold their water supply in our hands. The Cedar Street subdivision had been Millbrook's crown jewel when it was built 15 years ago, a collection of oversized houses on undersized lots, designed to attract the county's political and business elite. Now, in the grip of the worst drought in recorded history, it looked like a monument to hubris. Sarah drove slowly through the winding streets, noting the brown lawns, empty swimming pools, and water emergency signs posted on every corner. She counted at least a dozen water trucks, parked in driveways the expensive kind that charged premium rates for delivery service. Sheriff Bob Hendrick's house sat at the end of Cottonwood Lane, a sprawling ranch-style home with a garage and a yard that had once featured elaborate landscaping. Now it looked like a moonscape, complete with dead palm trees that someone had been too proud to remove. Sarah parked across the street and watched. At 6:47 p.m., a familiar Ford F-150 pulled into Hendrick's driveway, the same truck she'd seen watching her property the day before. The driver who emerged was younger than she'd expected, maybe early 30s, with the kind of lean build that came from hard physical work. He walked with the confident stride of someone comfortable in his own skin, but there was something about the way he constantly scanned his surroundings that spoke of military training or law enforcement. The front door opened before he could knock, and Sheriff Hendrick stepped out onto the porch. Even from across the street, Sarah could see the tension in both men's body language. Told you to be more careful, Hendrick's voice carried in the still evening air. If someone spots you, relax, Bob. Nobody saw anything. The younger man's voice was calm, professional. The injection system is working perfectly. Give it another week, maybe 2, and they'll be begging to sell. Sarah's blood turned to ice. She fumbled for her phone, activating the recording app just as Hendrick stepped closer to his visitor. And if they don't sell, then we increase the dosage. Trust me, nobody's going to want to drink water that makes them sick, especially not some old man with breathing problems. The casual cruelty in his voice made Sarah's vision blur with rage. These men weren't just stealing water, they were coldly calculating how much poison it would take to drive her family from their home. What about the daughter? Hendricks asked. She's not as easy to intimidate as the old man. Sarah Martinez. The younger man shrugged. Single woman, no kids, works part-time at the library. What's she going to do? File a complaint with you? Both men laughed, and the sound was like nails on a chalkboard. Just make sure this stays quiet, Hendrick said. The last thing we need is word getting out that we're connected to this. Don't worry. By the time anyone figures out what happened, the Martinez family will be long gone, and you'll have that water flowing to where it belongs. Where it belongs. Sarah gripped her phone so tightly her knuckles went white. These men talked about her family's century-old water rights like they were discussing the weather. The younger man climbed back into his truck, and Sarah got a clear look at his license plate as he backed out of the driveway. She memorized the numbers, then waited until both vehicles were gone before starting her own car. But instead of going home, she drove to the old county courthouse. The building was officially closed for the evening, but Sarah had her father's keys, a relic from his decades as water commissioner. The basement archives were exactly as she remembered from childhood visits. Rows of filing cabinets containing every water rights document, survey map, and engineering report filed in Millbrook County since territorial days. It took her 40 minutes to find what she was looking for. The original water rights agreement between her great-grandfather and the county, signed in 1924 and updated only twice since then. But it was the addendum from 1963 that made her smile, a document that gave the Martinez family not just water rights, but explicit control over any infrastructure they had paid to install or maintain. Infrastructure that now included the master valve system that controlled water flow to half the county. Sarah photographed every page, then made copies for good measure. As she worked, a plan began forming in her mind, not just for revenge, but for justice. These people thought they could poison her family and steal their water because they held political power. They thought that badge and title and position meant they could do whatever they wanted to whoever they wanted. They were about to learn otherwise. Sarah locked the courthouse behind her and drove home through the darkness. Past subdivisions full of people who had no idea that their water supply was about to disappear. Past the Cedar Street development, where Sheriff Hendricks was probably sleeping peacefully, confident that his scheme was working perfectly. Past the industrial park where 3 county commissioners had their offices, and the new municipal building where the city council met every Tuesday night, all of them dependent on water that flowed through valves controlled by the Martinez. Sarah Martinez stood in her basement at 3:17 a.m., staring at the brass valve wheel that her great-grandfather had installed nearly a century ago. The wheel was surprisingly small, barely 8 inches in diameter, but the pipe it controlled carried the main water line to Cedar Street subdivision, where Sheriff Bob Hendricks and his co-conspirators slept peacefully, believing their poisoning scheme was proceeding without detection. She'd spent the last 6 hours preparing, first, photographing every inch of the valve system to document its original state, then, testing each connection point to ensure she understood exactly which neighborhoods would lose water when she made her move. Finally, she'd driven through those same neighborhoods one last time, memorizing the locations of elderly residents, families with young children, and anyone else who might suffer unfairly from her actions. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same compassion that made her hesitate to cut off innocent people's water was exactly what her enemies had counted on when they decided to slowly poison her family. But Sarah had found a solution that would satisfy both her conscience and her need for justice. The Cedar Street subdivision had been built with a separate line from the rest of the residential area. Premium feature that allowed the wealthy residents to maintain higher water pressure for their elaborate landscaping and oversized homes. Her great-grandfather's system included individual control valves for each section, meaning she could target the people responsible without affecting their innocent neighbors. Sarah gripped the valve wheel with both hands. The metal was cold, against her palms worn smooth by decades of her father's careful maintenance. 1/4 turn counterclockwise would reduce water pressure to Cedar Street by half. A full turn would stop the flow entirely. She chose the middle ground 3/4 of a turn that would leave just enough water for basic household needs, but nowhere near enough for the comfort these people had grown accustomed to. The valve turned with surprising ease, as if it had been waiting years for this moment. Sarah heard the subtle change in the water flow through the pipes above her head, a shift from the steady rush of full pressure to the restricted gurgle of a system under stress. By sunrise, every house on Cedar Street would be experiencing technical difficulties with their water supply. Sarah climbed the basement stairs and found her father awake in the kitchen, sipping coffee made from their emergency water supply. "It's done," Miguel asked. "Phase 1. Sarah poured herself a cup of coffee, surprised by how steady her hands were. Just the pressure reduction. Enough to get their attention, not enough to cause a humanitarian crisis. And if they don't, get the message. Sarah's smile was as cold as the dawn light filtering through the kitchen windows. Then we escalate. Her phone rang at 7:23 a.m. The caller ID showed Millbrook County Sheriff's Department. "Miss Martinez, this is Deputy Williams. Sheriff Hendricks would like to speak with you about a water issue affecting your neighborhood. Could you come down to the station this morning?" Sarah almost laughed. Less than 4 hours after she'd reduced their water pressure, and they were already trying to intimidate her. "What kind of water issue, Deputy? Technical problems with the county lines? The sheriff thinks you might have some insight, given your father's background with the Water Commission. Tell Sheriff Hendricks I'll be happy to discuss water issues with him. How about 2 p.m. at my house? He can bring whoever he thinks might be helpful." Silence on the other end. "Ma'am, the sheriff was hoping you could come to the station. 2 p.m. at my house. Deputy, if the sheriff wants to discuss my family's water, he can do it on my family's property." Sarah hung up and immediately called Patricia Jenkins at the lab. "Patricia, I need you to do me a favor. Can you test our well water again today?" "Already? Planned on it." "Sarah, I ran some additional tests yesterday, and the contamination levels are actually increasing. Whatever's being introduced to your system is being added on a regular schedule." "How regular?" "Based on the concentration patterns, I'd guess every 12 to 24 hours. Someone's treating your well like their personal dumping ground." "Perfect." Sarah looked at her watch. 7:30 a.m. If the pattern held, her poisoners would be making another deposit sometime between now and tomorrow morning, and when they did, she'd be ready. "Patricia, can you recommend a good water testing kit? Something that would show contamination immediately, for field testing?" "Sure. There's a kit that changes color in the presence of industrial chemicals. Not as accurate as lab work, but it'll tell you if someone's messing with your water in real time. I'll pick one up this morning. Sarah spent the next hour setting up surveillance equipment around the well-housed mixture of trail cameras, borrowed from her neighbor's hunting supplies and motion sensors connected to her phone. If anyone approached their water supply, she'd know about it instantly. Then she drove to town to gather intelligence. The Millbrook Cafe was ground zero for local gossip, and Sarah wasn't disappointed. The morning coffee crowd was buzzing with complaints about water pressure problems throughout the newer developments. Started around 5 this morning, complained Janet Morrison, whose husband served on the city council. Barely enough pressure to run the dishwasher. Same at our place, added Tom Chen, who owned the hardware store. Called the county, but they said it's probably just increased demand from the drought. Sarah sipped her coffee and listened, noting who seemed genuinely concerned about the water issues versus who looked like they might know more than they were letting on. It was a small-town skill she'd learned as a child, reading the difference between innocent worry and guilty knowledge in people's faces. What she didn't expect was to see the young man from Sheriff Hendrick's driveway sitting alone in a corner booth, nursing a cup of coffee and watching her with undisguised interest. Their eyes met across the cafe, and Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't the casual observation of a curious stranger. This was the focused attention of someone who'd been sent to watch her. Sarah finished her coffee, left money on the counter, and walked directly to his table. "Enjoying your breakfast?" she asked pleasantly. Up close, he was younger than she'd thought, probably not much older than 30, with the kind of military bearing that spoke of recent service. His hands were calloused from manual labor, but his eyes were sharp with intelligence. "Just coffee, thanks." His voice was the same one she'd recorded the night before, calm, professional, and utterly without conscience. "You're Sarah Martinez, right? Miguel's daughter?" "That's right. And you are?" "Jake Morrison. I work for the county water department." Sarah kept her expression neutral, but her mind was racing. Morrison, the same last name as Janet Morrison, the city councilman's wife she'd just heard complaining about water pressure. Family connections were everything in small towns, and this particular connection explained a lot. Any relation to Janet Morrison? "She's my aunt." Jake's smile was all surface charm with nothing behind it. "Small world, right?" "Very small." Sarah pulled out her phone and showed him the photo she'd taken of his license plate. "Small enough that I noticed your truck parked outside my property yesterday." For just a moment, Jake's composure slipped. His eyes flickered with something that might have been respect or might have been calculation. "Must be mistaken," he said. "Lot of trucks look alike around here. Must be." Sarah put her phone away. "Well, Jake Morrison from the county water department. If you're ever in the neighborhood again, feel free to stop by. I'd love to show you our well system. It's quite remarkable, been running strong for almost 100 years. I might take you up on that." "Please do. Bring Sheriff Hendricks with you. I understand he's very interested in water issues these days." Jake's smile faltered completely. Sarah gave him her brightest smile in return, then walked out of the cafe with the satisfaction of knowing she'd just declared war in the politest possible terms. The rest of the morning passed quietly. Sarah picked up the water testing kit from the lab, installed additional security measures around the well house, and prepared her house for the afternoon confrontation with Sheriff Hendricks. At 1:47 p.m., 3 vehicles pulled into her driveway. Sheriff Hendricks arrived in his official patrol car, followed by Jake Morrison in his F-150, and a third man Sarah didn't recognize driving a county utility truck. 3 against 1 meant to intimidate. Sarah met them on her front porch, where she'd arranged chairs in a semicircle that forced her visitors to sit with the afternoon sun in their eyes while she remained in shade. "Sheriff," she said pleasantly. "Jake, and you are." The third man was older, maybe 60, with the soft build of someone who'd spent more years behind a desk than in the field. "County Commissioner Davis. I understand you might have some insight into our water pressure problems." "I might." Sarah settled into her chair like a queen holding court. "But first, I think we should address the elephant in the room, which is," Hendricks asked. Sarah pulled out her phone and played the recording she'd made outside his house. The men's voices carried clearly in the still afternoon air. "Increase the dosage. Nobody's going to want to drink water that makes them sick, ... especially, not some old man with breathing problems." The silence that followed was profound. Commissioner Davis went pale. Jake Morrison's hand